As you guys may know, Dave was in a bad car accident, and he was supposed to preach this morning, but obviously he's not here because of that. So I'm preaching, and I'm continuing in his series called Intersections, and today we're talking about Abraham, and this sermon is called Move. And we are going to be looking at Hebrews chapter 11. So if you want to turn in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. And as I was thinking about Abraham, I was thinking, man, Abraham is one of the most famous people in the Bible, all right? He's like, as people that get mentioned in the Bible, he has something like over 300 mentions throughout the entire scripture. So he's very famous. He's number 8 in the Bible, and that's not including God's name, but if you're just including men, he's number 8 as far as mentions in the Bible. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking, well, who's somebody that I know in my life who's like the most famous person that I know? And I've got a picture for you. See, this is me on the right over here, okay? And over here, this guy right here, his name is Justin. And he's probably the most famous person that I know. This is a picture of us when we were freshmen in high school. And I lived in Florida as a freshman in high school, and then after my freshman year, we moved to Michigan. And after my freshman year, that was pretty much the last time I had talked to Justin. And a few years ago, I think it was like 2011, 2012, one of my other friends named Andrew calls me up and he says, hey, I'm going to New York City to see Justin on Broadway. And I was like, Justin who? He's like, you know, Justin, you knew him in high school. And I'm like, he's on Broadway? Like, what? Like, is he part of the chorus or something? Like, this is what I'm thinking. He's like, no, he's like the star. He's like the lead character on Broadway. And I'm thinking, Justin, I was like, that kid, that short, pudgy kid that I used to know is on Broadway. I was like, this doesn't make any sense. And he goes, you haven't seen Justin in a while, have you? And so, like, what if I told you that Justin was Spider-Man in the musical, right? Like, that doesn't look like Spider-Man, right? So this is, oh, there he is. There he goes. He got a little taller and lost some weight. And it was amazing, like, watching him. He could, like, I never heard him sing before. And he obviously, he's on Broadway, so he can sing really well. And he's doing all of these acrobatics. I went and saw him, and I showed him that picture earlier. And he's like, oh, yeah, you got a picture of that short, pudgy kid. So, yeah. So he's, like, probably the most famous person I know. But Abraham is one of the most famous people in the Bible. In Genesis, he's the second most famous person in Genesis. And I was reading, I wanted to read the story of Abraham. I want to read all about Abraham. And so I opened up the book of Genesis and started looking at the story of Abraham. And if you ever want to read the whole story of Abraham, it's only like 14 chapters in the book of Genesis. And I sat down and I was like, okay, I'm going to pretend like I know absolutely nothing about Abraham and who he is. And if I'm going to look at Abraham, I'm going to read his story and understand who Abraham is, and I want to look like, what are the intersections of Abraham? Who is Abraham, and why is Abraham so famous? So I started reading about Abraham. The first chapter when we're talking about Abraham, the first thing we see is, like, he goes down to Egypt, and he's got a wife, and her name's Sarah, and the scripture makes it very clear, Sarah's a very beautiful woman. And he goes down to Egypt, and he's afraid that if he tells the Pharaoh that Sarah is his wife, that the Pharaoh will kill Abraham and take his wife. Okay? So instead, Abraham says that Sarah is not his wife. Sarah is his sister, which is kind of technically true. Half-sister. But anyway, that doesn't really matter. He kind of tells a little bit of a lie, and next thing you know, the Egyptians are getting all sorts of sickness because the Pharaoh, he sees Abraham's sister and he thinks, oh, this man's got this sister. I'm going to take her to be my wife, which is, obviously not okay. And so then Pharaoh figures the whole thing out and he gives Sarah back to Abraham. It's like, why did you tell me she was your sister? And he says, well, I didn't want you to kill me. So we think, okay, we look at that story and this intersection in Abraham's life. When he has to make this decision, he's scared. And what does he do when he's scared? He comes up with a plot, a scheme, and a lie in order to get out of it. And we can relate to that, right? You've had times in your life where maybe you've been scared, or you've been plotting and scheming and trying to kind of figure out a way to skirt around something that maybe you shouldn't be doing it. And you look at Abraham and you think, okay, Abraham's learned from his mistake and he's not going to do this again. And then a few chapters later, he goes down to see King Abimelech. And what does he tell King Abimelech? Sarah is his... This is the part where you guys chime in. Yes, very good, thank you. Sister. And he goes through the whole thing again, and it's like the same exact story, and he hasn't learned from his mistakes. And of course, we can learn from this also. We can say, okay, we made mistakes, and we say, oh, we're never going to do that again. That was a bad idea. And then pretty soon we find ourselves going down that same exact path again, only to have the same results. So I'm reading through all these stories about Abraham, looking at the different crossroads in his life. We see that God has given him a promise that he's going to have children, but he's having a hard time waiting for that promise. So because his wife can't have a child, so he has a child with his wife's servant, and it's just kind of a mess. And so we're reading through this whole, and I'm like, why is this guy? What did he do? Why is this guy so famous? What is he so famous for? And when we get to the New Testament, and when we read about Abraham throughout the Old Testament, we read a lot of verses that are like this one, the one that we find in Galatians. And it says, Galatians chapter 3, in verse 6, it says, "So also Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness." So this is why Abraham's famous. He's not famous for a lot of the things that he did. He's famous because he believed in God. He was famous because he put his faith in God. And in Hebrews, where we're going to be reading today, when we turn to chapter 11, go to verse 8, we hear the writer of Hebrews is talking about Abraham and talking about his faith and why Abraham's faith made him so famous. In verse 8, it says, "By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going." So here we see the first instructions that Abraham receives from God. He tells Abraham to move away from his home to a new place where I'm going to show you. And so Abraham listens to God, and he follows God by faith. This last summer, I went up to Michigan to visit an old friend from high school, and he had a four-wheeler, and I had never ridden a four-wheeler before. And I've ridden one, but I never drove one before. And so I got on the four-wheeler. We can go to the picture in case you don't know what four-wheeler is. All right? So this is going to be me in a second here, okay? So I got on this four-wheeler, and he's showing me how to drive. He's like, it's just like driving a motorcycle. Or drove a motorcycle either. All right, so he shows me how to drive the four-wheeler, and I get on, and he shows me how to shift and all these things, shift into the gears. And so I take a little lap around his yard, and then he's got some trails back out in the woods, and I'm excited about the trails, not the lap around the yard. So I do the lap around the yard, and my son Amos jumps on the four-wheeler with me, and I'm like, all right, I got this. And I go full gun and just take off into the woods, and I hear my friend yelling something. He's yelling something at me, but I don't care. I've got my son on a four-wheeler, and we've got the wind in our face, and we're going into the woods, and we're flying down the trails, and we come to the trails, and some of the trails have these drop-offs, kind of like this onto the sides. And so we're taking down into this trail, and all of a sudden, the trail stops. It's like, no big deal. The trail stops. I'm just going to put it in reverse and turn around. I didn't know how to put it in reverse. And so I'm sitting there like this, and Amos and I went from having a whole lot of fun to Amos now panicking because his dad doesn't know what's going on. His confidence in me had gone way down, and I tried to go up a hill and then come back down a hill. And I'm trying to get this thing to turn around, and Amos is like, okay, Dad, I'm just going to get off, and I'm going to walk back, because he didn't want to be with me anymore. And when I finally got it turned around, my friend goes, I was yelling, I forgot to tell you how to go in reverse. And so if you, when we listen to God and God calls us to go somewhere, it can be intimidating. And we follow God, and when we follow God, God is going to take care of us. All right, we can have a lot more confidence in God than Amos had in me on that day. There's been a lot of times in my life where I can relate to Abraham here. There's been a lot of times in my life where I've just felt God calling me to move, and I moved. And when I got there, I had no idea what was going to happen, and God, every time, has taken care of me. The first time was when I was in college. I finished a semester at Florida Christian College, and I felt God calling me to go up to Great Lakes, which is in Michigan, 22 hours away from where my parents lived. And I got in the car and drove up there with my brother, and it was great. You know, I had a great year at school, or 4 years, 5 years maybe. And then after that, after school was over, I had no idea where I was going to go. Like, I had no church, nothing. I had an internship that might have turned into a job, and that was back in Florida, so we drove all the way back down to Florida, went to this internship. It was in 2008, which you guys know, by the end of the summer, there was like this huge recession. No jobs in Florida after that. And I felt God saying, go back to Michigan. Got in the car, drove to Michigan, nowhere to live. All right, stayed with some friends out there. 2 weeks after getting up to Michigan, a church calls that I had preached at a couple times in college and says, hey, we're here, you're in town, why don't you come preach for us because we don't have a minister. So I went and preached there and filled the pulpit for a little while, and then pretty soon they hired me. So, I ended up spending 4 years at that church preaching. And after 4 years of being at that church, I felt God calling me, move to East Michigan. And I didn't want to move to East Michigan. That's like, Michigan is a great state. It's one of my favorite places, but East Michigan, it should not be part of the state. Okay. I didn't really want to go to East Michigan, but I really felt God calling me there. And we didn't have any, we told the church, we said, we just feel God calling us to go to East Michigan. And they're like, oh, do you have a church out there? No, we don't have anything. We're just, God, we just feel like God's calling us there. So I put in my resignation, and as the week before we got there, we had this church call and said, "Hey, we'd like you to come in, fill in doing worship." And so I got there and I filled in with worship, and they said, "Hey, we got this position with worship and youth ministry." And so I can relate to this, I can relate to Abraham, and all those times when I did those things, all right, I put my family on the line, my everything on the line, and did those things. I was like, I'm trusting in God to come through here, and God comes through. And when I trust in God and God comes through, what does that do? That increases my faith. And so, you look at Abraham and say, Abraham is like. That's the scary thing. He's in a totally different time. He's told to leave Ur with his family and take some people and go, and wherever God leads you, that's where you're going to go. And Abraham follows God. And so we can see God's putting his faith in Abraham, and God comes through with Abraham. And if you read the story of Abraham becomes a very rich man, and he's putting his faith in God, and God is taking care of him. In the next verse there in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 9, it says, by faith he made his home in the promised land. Like a stranger in a foreign country, he lived in tents as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder was God. Okay, so he's looking forward to being in this foreign nation where the architect and builder is God. One of the questions, I don't know if you guys have known me very long. I'm not very good at I'm not good at small talk. Well, small talk with people. And one of the questions that everybody always asks, that's supposed to be this great conversation starter is oh, hey, where are you from? And for me, where am I from is a really complicated question. Because as you've just heard, just in the few years after I was married, I moved, all over the place. And as I grew up, my father was a missionary. And then after he was done being a missionary, he was a minister. And so, I was born in Florida. I spent some time living in Brazil, spent some more time living in Florida, spent some time living in Michigan. My sister was born in California. Somehow that fits into the timeline of my life. So like we like moved everywhere as kids, and then now as an adult, I've lived in several different places. I think when I was like 7 years old, I'd lived in like 8 different houses by the time. So like I've moved everywhere, right? I've been all sorts of different places. And so people ask me where I'm from, and it's like, what do they, what do they want to know? Like, I was born in Florida. It's like, is that where I'm from? I lived the longest time in Michigan. Is that where I'm from? Never in the same city. I mean, but, I live more in Michigan than anywhere else. So is that where I'm from? One time I was at a meeting at the camp, and somebody goes, hey, where are you from? And I'm like, started telling him my entire life story, the whole thing. This is where I'm from. I did this, and I lived here and there in California, Florida, Michigan, Brazil, all these places. And they're like, "Oh, I meant like, where do you live right now?" I was like, "Oh, yeah, Greentown. I drove 20 minutes. It took me to get here." So. Where am I from is like this hard question, and I think of it, when I really think about it, like where do I belong? I feel like I belong not to this kingdom, but I feel like I belong to a different kingdom. I believe I belong to God's kingdom, and that's where I'm from. I think it's you guys, a lot of you guys here anyway. Like I can't imagine what it's like to live in the same place for my entire that just is really weird. Like I can't imagine being an adult in the same place that I was a kid. All right, I go home with my parents, and I feel like a kid. I can't imagine ever feeling like an adult if I was around them all the time. But I feel like I belong to a different kingdom. The other day, my kids were like, we were talking about armies and stuff, and they were like, we were talking about my brother. He was in the Navy, and they go, how come you were never in the Army? And I was like, I was in the Army. And they were like, really? And I said, the Lord's Army. Yes, sir. And they weren't impressed with that. But yeah, I feel like I belong to a different kingdom, to a different place. It's like this kingdom that is built by God. Like that God is the architecture, that God is the builder. And I think that everyone who is a Christian, like that is our main place that we say we're from. We're from God's. Yes, we grew up in Greentown, but we are part of God's kingdom. And so when we look at Abraham had faith because he wasn't his own man. It wasn't about where he lived. It was about doing and living and being where God wanted him to be. The next verse, it says this in chapter 11, verse 11. It says, by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbirth age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so, from this one man, and he who was good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. And so this gives us a little bit more insight about Abraham and his faith. In Romans, it describes Sarah, says that her womb was dead. Like there was like no way she was ever going to be able to have children. And in here it describes Abraham. Abraham was as good as dead. He was old. He was so old. He was way too old to ever have children. And they put their faith and they believed in God, even though it seemed impossible. And the promise that God gives to Abraham, as I was reading through the story of Abraham, like this seems like the kind of blessing that anybody in that time period would have just loved. Or like that was the kind of blessing that anybody from that time period was hoping for. Like for someone to say, you are going to be the parent of a great nation. Like that was like, oh, that's like I'm going to have descendants, and those descendants are going to be somebody. Like if you really wanted to like bless somebody, you would say, bless you. May your kids be a great nation, and may their nation conquer all the enemy nations of them. Like, this was like just the greatest blessing that they could hope for. And this, when we read through the Bible, there's 300 some mentions of Abraham. This is the thing that's most mentioned about Abraham. Of all the thing, of his faith, of all the things in his faith, this is the most important one. That God came to Abraham and he said, Abraham, I'm going to bless you and I'm going to give you this great nation. You're going to have many descendants, as many as the stars in the sky, and as many as the sand on the seashore. He gives them this blessing, and this is Abraham. This is what Abraham is most famous for right here. He looks at God and he says, okay. That's why Abraham is famous, right? God says, I'm going to do all these things for you. I've got this promise for you that is just going to change your life, and you're going to have this great land. You're going to have this great nation. Your children are going to be able to defeat their enemies. I'm going to protect them. I'm going to be their God, and they are going to be my people. And Abraham, most famous thing, okay, I believe you. I believe what you are telling me is true. This is what Abraham is famous for. When we talk about Abraham, it's like the God of Abraham, the guy who was the father of the great nation, because God said, I got a promise for you, and David said, okay, I believe you. There's another verse in Galatians, this is verse 7. And it says, understand then that those who have faith are children of Abraham. And in this verse we see that promise that was given to Abraham, this is a promise that because of Jesus is extended to each and every one of us. And because of Jesus, this promise is actually even better than what Abraham received. Abraham received, you're going to be a father of a great nation. And we receive, you're going to be a part of a great nation. And not a great nation here on this earth, but you're going to be part of a kingdom that's going to last forever and ever. And God says, I'm promising you this. I'm going to give you all this. I'm going to give you a life eternal. And it's our job to respond to that. It's our job to say, okay, I believe you, God. Let's do this. What do we got to do next? My mom got into looking up in our family history, and there's all these websites that you can go on now where you can look at, you can see who your great-great-great-grandfather was. And as they were going through, she found this picture of this guy in our family. And my parents think it's really funny because they think he looks like me. I don't know, that maybe. And I don't know what this guy's name is. I think at some point he might have been a war criminal, which is not great. But he's like part of my lineage, right? He's my great, I don't know, some way down the line. I don't know anything about him. I don't remember him. Obviously, nobody in our family remembers him or tells stories about him. And then I think my great-grandfather. I don't know my great-grandfather's name. I don't know any of my great-grandfather's name. I don't know any of my great-grandmother's names. I don't remember anything about them. I don't know anything about. I don't know anything about them. We spend so much of our lives focused on so many things that nobody's going to remember. Nobody's going to remember what you did in school. Nobody's going to remember what your job was. They probably won't even remember your name. You could be super famous even, and after a generation, people forget who you are. This is what you will be remembered for, though. God is going to remember. God has offered this promise to you. He says, I'm giving you this promise of everlasting life. And God is going to remember for all eternity whether you accepted that promise or not. And right now, we offer an opportunity for you to respond, or an opportunity for you to come forward in church and say, I believe. Okay, God, I believe what you are telling me. It's an opportunity for you to come and to confess that you believe in Jesus. It's an opportunity for you to be baptized and to start a new life in Christ. So if you haven't made that decision, this is a time to come forward. If you have made that decision, I want you to reflect on that and think about how that is the most important thing that everything else you do is garbage, okay? That is the most important thing that you have done with your life. And think about how that changes you this week and how that helps you to live and love and grow in a relationship with Jesus.